The boy at the gate had his mother's eyes, though the Duke of Harkstead did not yet know it, and would not have believed it if he had. Alaric Vane, the 9th Duke of Harkstead, had ridden out through the east gate on a grey autumn morning, meaning only to see the flooded meadow with his own eyes, and instead he found a small figure standing in the road with his hand against the iron bars, as if he had every right to be there. Alaric drew up his horse. The mist lay low over the park, and the great house behind him was still shuttered against the cold, and there in the middle of all that silver stillness stood a small boy in a coat too large for him, looking up at the Duke with an expression that Alaric could not name and would spend the rest of the morning trying to forget. "You are trespassing," Alaric said, because it was the sort of thing he said, and because 39 years of being obeyed had left him little else to say to strangers. The boy did not run. He tipped his head back and studied the man on the horse with a grave, unhurried attention, and then he said in a clear, small voice, "Is this Harkstead?" A woman on the coach said Harkstead was where the wicked Duke lives. Alaric ought to have laughed. Instead, something cold moved through him, a draught from a door he had thought long since bricked shut. "Who told you that?" "Nobody told me the last part," the boy admitted. "I made it up, but I did want to see it. My mother worked here once." He said it the way a boy says a thing he has been carrying a great distance carefully, so as not to spill it. "Before I was born." The horse shifted under him. Alaric held it still. He looked at the child's face, at the fair hair the mist had beaded silver, at the shape of the mouth, and though he told himself it was nothing, that half the fair-haired boys in the county had such faces, some older grief in him had already begun to count on its fingers and did not like the sum. "What is your name?" Alaric asked. "Thomas." "Thomas what?" The boy considered this. "Just Thomas," he said. "My mother says a name is only a place people can find you, and she doesn't want us found." He seemed to realize then that he had said too much, and his small hand tightened on the iron bar. "I have to go back before she wakes. She'll be frightened. Where is back?" But the boy was already stepping away from the gate, back into the mist, quick and light as a hare, and though Alaric called after him once, sharply, the road curved and the fog took him and he was gone. Alaric sat his horse in the empty lane for a long time. The flooded meadow went unseen. When at last he turned the horse's head toward the house, he found that his hands were not quite steady on the reins, and he was a man who prided himself, above almost all things, on the steadiness of his hands. 6 years. It had been 6 years since he had stood in the yellow drawing room and listened to his cousin Rupert lay out the evidence with that soft, regretful voice, and had felt the whole warm structure of his happiness fall in on itself, like a house of cards. 6 years since he had summoned Eleanor Rushmore to that same room and looked at her white face, at the way she had pressed her hand flat against the front of her plain grey gown as if to hold something in, and had said the words that had unmade them both. He remembered the words. He had carried them a long time. "I know what you have done. I will not be made a fool of by a servant. You will leave this house today, and you will not come back, and you will thank God I do not have you taken up before the magistrate." She had not wept. That was the thing that had lodged in him like a splinter and never worked its way out. She had stood very straight and looked at him with those steady grey eyes, and she had said only, "You believe him. Of course you believe him. He is a Vane and I am a housemaid, and there is nothing in the world so cheap as my word against his." And then she had gone. He had watched from the window as she walked down the drive with a single small bag, not once looking back, and he had told himself he felt nothing but the clean, cold satisfaction of a wrong made right. He had been lying to himself even then. He knew that now. He had known it for 6 years and had built a life around not knowing it. Alaric gave the horse to a groom in the yard and went into the house and could not have said, an hour later, how he had spent that hour. He knew only that when his cousin Rupert came down to breakfast, immaculate and smiling as he always was, Alaric looked at him across the ruin of the eggs and the cold toast and felt, for the first time in 6 years, a doubt. "You look grim, cousin," Rupert said, unfolding his napkin. "The meadow as bad as they say?" "I did not reach the meadow." Alaric watched him. Rupert Vane was a handsome man of 32, with the family's dark hair and none of its heaviness, a man who had made himself so useful and so pleasant over the years that Alaric had stopped noticing he was there at all, the way one stops noticing a clock that has always kept good time. He had come to Harkstead a poor relation after his father's debts, and he had stayed, and Alaric had never grudged it. He was family. There was little enough family left. There was a boy at the east gate, Alaric said. A child, fair-haired. He said his mother had worked here once. He had not planned to say it. He watched Rupert's face when he said it, and afterward he was never quite sure whether he had imagined the flicker, the small stillness, quickly covered, the way a man's face goes when a card he has been counting on falls wrong. It lasted an instant. Then Rupert laughed and reached for the coffee. Half the mothers in 3 parishes worked here once, cousin. We are the largest house in the county. You cannot go collecting every foundling that wanders up the lane. He drank. You look as though you have seen a ghost. Do I? Said Alaric. He said nothing more. But that afternoon he went alone to the estate office, and he took down the great leather book in which the steward recorded every servant hired and dismissed, wages and dates and characters, and he turned the stiff pages back 6 years, and he found the entry, and he read it 3 times. Eleanor Rushmore, housemaid, dismissed without character. Theft, on the word of Mr. Rupert Vane, theft. He had forgotten or made himself forget the shape the accusation had taken. Rupert had come to him grave and reluctant with a story of missing plate and a length of Brussels lace from the late Duchess's chest, and a maid scene where she had no business, and letters there had been letters, hadn't there, letters Rupert said he had found. Letters in which Eleanor spoke of a wealthy protector, and a plan to be gone with what she could carry. Alaric had read them. He remembered reading them. He had loved her, God help him. He had been on the very edge of the unthinkable, of making a duke's marriage to a housemaid, and the whole county would have laughed and his dead mother's memory would have shuddered, and he had been going to do it anyway, and Rupert's letters had shown him a woman who had never loved him at all, who had seen in the doting Duke of Harkstead only a soft rich fool to be milked and left. And Alaric, whose pride was the load-bearing wall of his whole soul, had cast her out rather than bear that. He had never asked to see her answer. He had never let her speak. I know what you have done, he had said, and had not once, in all his life, said, Tell me what you have done. He sat in the estate office as the light went blue and then grey outside the narrow window, and he thought about a small boy with fair hair standing at his gate saying, My mother doesn't want us found. And for the first time in 6 years the Duke of Harkstead let himself think a thought he had forbidden himself, and the thought was this: what if none of it was true? He did not sleep. He lay in the great cold bed in the great cold room, and he assembled, plank by plank, the case he had never allowed himself to examine, and the more he examined it the worse it looked, not against Eleanor, but against himself. The letters had never been in her hand. He had taken Rupert's word that they were. The missing lace had never been found on her. It had only been missing, and who kept the keys to the late Duchess's chest but Rupert, who had made himself so useful with the family's private affairs. The maid scene where she had no business seen by whom? By Rupert. Always by Rupert. And why in God's name had Rupert been so very grave and so very reluctant and so very quick, all in the same breath, to spare the Duke the pain of a marriage beneath him? Because Rupert Vane, if the Duke of Harkstead did not marry, and did not get an heir, stood next in the line. Alaric had never let himself do that sum either. He did it now in the dark, and it came out clean and ugly and whole. At first light he sent for the one man at Harkstead who owed nothing to Rupert, old Barnaby Soul, who had been the late Duke's own valet, and was now pensioned to a cottage on the home farm, half blind and wholly honest, and who had been in the house the year Eleanor was cast out. Alaric went to him himself on foot, and sat on a stool in the low smoky room and asked the old man to tell him, plainly, what the servants' hall had believed 6 years ago about the maid Eleanor Rushmore. Barnaby Soul was quiet a long time. Then he said, Your Grace will not thank me for it. I have not come to be thanked. I have come to be told the truth. You will not suffer for it, whatever it is. You have my word. The old man turned his cloudy eyes toward the fire. There was not a soul below stairs believed she took so much as a pin, he said. She was the honestest girl in the house and the gentlest, and she nursed the cook through the fever of the winter before at risk of her own life, and there was not one of us would not have sworn for her, but nobody asked us. Your Grace dismissed her before dinner, and by nightfall she was gone, and Mr. Rupert stood in the hall and told the housekeeper that the Duke would take it very ill if the girl's name were ever spoke again in the house. And it never was. He paused. We knew, Your Grace. We all knew whose word had done it, and we knew why. A poor man that stands to be a duke will find a reason to keep the Duke from marrying. But we were servants, and he was a vain, and you were half mad with the pain of it, and would hear no one. So we held our tongues and let a good girl go out into the world with nothing, and I have been ashamed of it every day since. There you would have the truth, and there it is. Alaric sat with it. The fire ticked. Somewhere outside a rook was calling. There was a matter, he said at last, and his voice was not steady, of letters. Letters in her hand that spoke of a protector, a plan. I never saw them, said Barnaby Sole, nor did any that could read her hand, but I will tell your grace this. Eleanor Rushmore could no more write such a letter than she could fly, for the plain reason that she could scarce write her own name. She'd had no schooling. She used to have the young footman read her the letters that came from her mother and cry over them, because she could not read them herself. He turned his blind face full on the Duke. Whoever wrote those letters, your grace, it was not that girl. She hadn't the letters in her head to do it. I'd stake my soul. The room was very quiet. Alaric rose. He found that he had to hold the edge of the mantel a moment. 6 years he had built upon a forgery, so brazen that its very brazenness had protected it for who would dare, who would dare. Forge a housemaid's confession to a duke. And the answer was a man who had lived under that duke's roof and eaten at his table and been trusted with the keys to his dead mother's linen, and who had watched, smiling, for 6 years, while the Duke of Harkstead punished himself for a crime that had never happened. Thank you, Alaric said. You have done me a greater service than any man in this house these 6 years. I will not forget it. At the low door he stopped. The boy, he said. A fair-haired boy, 6 years old, come lately into the district with a woman who does not give her name. Have you heard of such? There's a seamstress took the old toll house on the Netherfield Road month back, said Barnaby Sole. Keeps to herself. Sues for the market town. Has a little lad. He hesitated. They do say he favours the family, your grace. About the eyes. Alaric walked back across the home farm in the thin gold light of the risen sun with his heart going like a hammer, and he did not go into the house. He went to the stable, and he saddled his own horse with his own hands, which he had not done in 20 years, and he rode out through the east gate and turned onto the Netherfield Road. The old toll house was a low stone building with a new swept step and a line of small washing on a rope and a single climbing rose gone to hip and thorn against the wall. Smoke stood straight up from the chimney in the still morning. Alaric got down from his horse in the lane and stood a moment with his hand on the saddle. This man before whom bishops and generals had gone carefully, and found that he did not know how to cross 20 feet of frosted grass to a cottage door. Then the door opened, and Eleanor Rushmore came out with a basket on her hip and saw him. She did not drop the basket. He would remember that. She stood in her own doorway in a plain brown dress with her sleeves turned back and her fair hair pinned up. 6 years older and thinner than he remembered and more beautiful than he had let himself remember, and she looked at the Duke of Harkstead standing in her lane, and every scrap of colour went out of her face. And then it came back all at once in a rush of anger so clean and so cold that he took an involuntary step backward. No, she said. No, whatever it is, no. You will get on that horse and you will go back where you came from, and you will not come here again, Eleanor. You do not have leave to say my name. Her voice shook, but she did not lower it. You said it once before in that yellow room, and I have spent 6 years walking away from the sound of it. I have a home now. I have work. I have something that is mine and that you cannot take. And I know why you have come. I saw at the moment I saw your face. Someone has told you, and I am telling you, and here at last her voice broke one crack, quickly mastered. I am telling you that you are 6 years too late, and he is mine, and you may not have him. And Alaric, Duke of Harkstead, before whom the whole county trembled, stood in the frosted lane with his hat in his hand and said the only true thing left in him. I know, he said. I know I am too late. I have not come to take him. I have come because I have learned this very morning what was done to you, and by whom, and I could not stay another hour under my own roof knowing it, and not come to tell you that I know that I believe you that I have always, in the part of me I was too proud to hear, known you never did the thing I say you did. He stopped. His voice was not the Duke's voice at all. I am not asking for anything. I have no right to ask. I have come to say I am sorry, and I know the word is worth nothing, and I have come to say it anyway, because you have been owed it for 6 years, and I would not have you go one more day unowed. Eleanor Rushmore stood very still. The washing lifted a little on its rope, and behind her, in the shadow of the doorway, a small fair head came round the frame of the door, and a small voice said, "Mother, is it the wicked Duke from the gate?" He rode home slowly, and for the length of that ride he let himself grieve, properly for the first time, not for what had been taken from him, but for what he himself had done. He thought of the girl who could not read her own mother's letters, weeping over them in the footman's clumsy voice. And he thought of the man who had known that, and had used the very thing she could not do to damn her with the thing she could not have done, and he thought of himself, the great Duke, who had held the truth in his own 2 hands in the form of those letters, and had never once thought to ask her to read a line of them aloud. 1 line. He could have unmade the whole lie with 1 line. "Read me this, Eleanor." But he had been too proud to give her the chance. Because a duke does not interrogate a housemaid, a duke pronounces, and so a duke had pronounced, and a good woman had gone out into 6 years of hunger carrying his son, and it had all turned upon a single question he had been too grand to ask. He did not spare himself any of it. He had spent 6 years sparing himself, wrapping the thing in the clean word justice, and he was done. A man who will not look at the worst of himself, he understood now, is a man another man can play like a fiddle, because there is always a lie he would rather believe. Rupert had understood that about him long before he had understood it about himself. Rupert had not deceived a fool. Rupert had deceived a proud man, which is easier, because a proud man deceives himself first, only wants help finishing the job. That was the true reckoning of it. And Alaric made himself hold it the whole way home, and by the time the towers of Hogsted rose grey above the bare trees, he had made a kind of grim peace with the size of the debt, not that it could be paid, but that he would spend what remained of his life not pretending it was smaller than it was. The house, when he came into it, looked different to him. He had lived in it all his life, and it had always been simply the house, the fact of himself made in stone. And now he walked through the cold marble hall, and saw it as she must have seen it the day she walked out, vast, and beautiful and pitiless, a place where a word from the man at the top could send a girl into the dark, and no floor would so much as creak in protest. He thought of all the servants who had known and said nothing, because saying something would have cost them everything, and he did not blame them, for he had built the very silence they kept. A duke gets the house he deserves. He had deserved a silent one. He began, quietly, that same week to change it. He did not make speeches, but he sent for the housekeeper and asked her, plainly, whether there were any among the servants who had suffered by his temper or his cousins over the years and gone unheard, and when the woman, astonished, ventured that there were 1 or 2, he set them right, and the story of that round below stairs faster than any command, and something in the great cold house began, very slightly, to thaw as if the master's long winter, breaking, had let little warmth down even into the stone. Neither of them moved. The boy came out onto the step and stood against his mother's skirts and looked up at the tall man in the lane, and Alaric looked down at him, and something in the Duke's chest that had been frozen for 6 years cracked all the way through. "He is not the wicked Duke," Eleanor said, and her hand found her son's shoulder and held it. Her eyes never left Alaric's face. "There is no wicked Duke, Thomas. There is only a foolish one." But she said it low, and there was something in it that was not quite hatred, and Alaric heard it, and hope came up in him so painfully that he had to look away. "I went to the gate," Thomas confided to him, not at all afraid now. "I wanted to see the house where my mother lived. You said I was trespassing." He considered the Duke gravely. "You have a very cross voice." "I have been told so," said Alaric, and to his own astonishment his voice was gentle. "I am sorry for it. I was not cross with you. I was surprised. I had not expected anyone so brave at my gate so early in the morning." The boy seemed to find this satisfactory. Eleanor drew him back against her. "Go in, Thomas. Your porridge is on the hob. Go on." And when the small feet had pattered back into the dark of the cottage, she folded her arms across herself and looked at the Duke with her steady grey eyes, and the anger had gone out of them and left something warier and harder to bear. "You believe me," she said, "after 6 years. Because a man told you this morning. Do you know what your believing me is worth to me now, Your Grace? I have raised him alone. I walked out of your house with what would fit in 1 bag, and I was carrying him and did not yet know it, and I have sawn and scrubbed and gone hungry so that he might not, in 3 counties, and every single day of it I knew I had done nothing, and it did not warm me once. And now you come and tell me you believe me, and I am to be grateful. She shook her head slowly. It is not that I hate you. I stopped hating you 2 winters ago. Hate is too dear to keep, it eats what little you have. It is that I do not know what you want me to do with it. Nothing, Alaric said. I want you to do nothing with it. It is not a debt I have come to have discharged. It is a debt I have come to acknowledge. There is a difference, and I have only lately learned it. He turned his hat in his hands. But there is a man in my house who forged your hand and stole my mother's lace and put both on you, and who has smiled at my table for 6 years, and I mean to see him answer for it, not for my sake, for yours, his. He glanced toward the doorway. That is a matter I can mend, and I will. Whatever you decide about the rest. For a moment she said nothing. Then, quietly, Rupert, you knew. I knew who wanted you unmarried, she said. I have had 6 years to think on it. Knowing was not the same as being believed. She looked at him a long time. He is your heir. If you unmake this, you unmake his whole standing. He will fight you. He will say the old valet is a doting fool, and I am a bitter woman, and the boy is any man's. Let him, said Alaric. I have every entry in the steward's book. I have Sol, who will swear you could not write the letters, and I will find the men who taught you your letters since and prove you learned them after, if it comes to that. I have my own memory, now that I am no longer afraid to use it, of a man too eager to spare me pain he was himself inflicting. And I have this. He looked down at the doorway again, where the small shadow hovered listening. I have his face. Eleanor's composure cracked, then not into tears but into a long, unsteady breath, and she put her hand against the doorframe as if the morning had suddenly grown too heavy to stand up in. Alaric did not go to her. He understood, at last, that he had lost the right to go to her, and that if he were ever to earn it back it would not be in a single frosted morning by the strength of his own remorse. So he stood where he was and he said, I will not come again unless you send for me. But I will send a man of law to set down, properly and for all time, that Eleanor Rushmore was falsely accused and is cleared of every charge, so that wherever you go the paper goes with you and no door need ever shut on that account again. That much you will let me do, because it costs you nothing and it is only the truth written down. Will you? She looked at him. Yes, she said. That I will let you do. He mounted and turned the horse, and at the bend in the lane he could not help himself and looked back. And she was still standing in the doorway with the boy's hand in hers, watching him go, and she did not look away, and he carried that the whole long ride home the way he had once carried the memory of her not weeping, but this time did not hurt in the same place, or in the same way. What passed at Harkstead House the following week the county would talk of for a generation. The Duke of Harkstead summoned his cousin to the yellow drawing-room, the same room. Alaric had chosen it deliberately, and there, with the family solicitor present, and the steward's book open on the table, and old Barnaby Saul seated, which the servants marked, a pensioned valet given a chair in the Duke's own drawing-room. Alaric laid the whole of it out in his cold, even voice, and watched his cousin's handsome face go from bland surprise to bluster to something white and finally horribly still. Rupert tried at the last the thing Eleanor had foretold. You would take the word of a half-blind old man and a bitter jade over your own blood, he said, and beggar your own hair for a housemaid and her bye-blow. Say that word again, Alaric said very quietly, and I will forget I am a gentleman. Rupert did not say it again. There was that in the Duke's face which no man who valued his teeth would have argued with, and Rupert Vane, whatever else he was, had always known which way the wind sat. The solicitor spread the papers. It was all set down, that Mr. Rupert Vane had, by his own eventual admission, for faced with the ledger, the hand, and the promise of a magistrate, he crumbled as such men do, forged the letters, secreted the lace, and borne false witness against Eleanor Rushmore, for the purpose of preventing the Duke's marriage and preserving his own place in the succession. He was not prosecuted. Alaric found he had no taste for the public ruin of his own name that a trial would bring, and less taste for teaching the boy Thomas, some day, that his father's house had hanged a cousin. Rupert was stripped of his allowance and his rooms and sent abroad with a small annuity and an absolute prohibition on returning to England while the Duke lived, and he went, and the smiling was quite gone out of him at last, and the servants' hall, which had held its tongue for 6 years, did not hold it now, and the tale of it went out through every kitchen in the county before the man had reached the coast. But that is not the part of the story Alaric would have told you mattered. The part that mattered came slowly, over that autumn and the winter that followed, and it could not be commanded, and it could not be bought, and the Duke of Harkstead, who had never in his life had to earn a single thing, set himself to earn it with a patience that astonished everyone who thought they knew him. He sent the paper that cleared her name as he had promised, and he sent nothing else, no money, which she would have flung back, no gifts, which would have insulted her only, once, a set of hornbooks and a slate and a spelling primer, addressed not to Eleanor, but to Thomas, with a short note that said the man who took his own letters had been the best teacher in 3 counties, and was lately without a pupil, and might the boy be spared to him 2 mornings in the week, at the schoolhouse in the village, among the other children. If the boy's mother saw no harm in it, Eleanor saw no harm in it. She wrote back in her own hand laboriously 3 lines, and Alaric kept the note the rest of his life that Thomas might go. And so the two taught the boy, and the boy, being clever, sometimes carried a message from the schoolhouse to the great house, and the great cross duke fell into the habit of walking down to the village on the mornings Thomas came, and of walking part of the way back with him toward the toll house, and of standing at the bend in the lane where he had once looked back, and talking at first about nothing, about the frost and the market prices, and whether the rose against the cottage wall would flower again come June, and Eleanor, watching from her doorway, saw that he did not once try to hurry it, and did not once presume, and did not once mistake her son for a means to her, but loved the boy plainly and for himself, clumsily at first, and then not clumsily at all, and something in her that had been closed against him for 6 years began, very slowly, against her own stern warning to herself, to open. It was Thomas, in the end, who said the thing neither of them could. Coming up the lane one blue evening at the very edge of spring, with the Duke walking beside him, the boy said, without any weight on it at all, "Mother cries sometimes when you've gone. Not the sad kind." I asked her which kind, and she said the other kind. "What's the other kind?" Alaric stopped in the lane. Ahead of them the toll house window was gold with lamplight, and Eleanor stood in the doorway, having heard their voices, with her sleeves turned back and her fair hair coming down and the light behind her. And she was looking at him across the frosted grass exactly as she had looked at him that first morning, not, this time, in anger, and not in weariness, and he found that he did not need Thomas to tell him what the other kind was, because he could see it, plain as the coming spring, in her face. He crossed the 20 feet of grass at last. He had waited a whole winter to be granted it, and he did not squander it. He stopped an arm's length from her, close enough that the lamplight touched them both, and he said, "Eleanor, I have no right to ask, and I have spent half a year earning the right to ask anyway, and I am going to ask, not for the boy's sake, for mine. Come home, not as anything you were, as my wife. Let me undo, so far as it can ever be undone, the wrong I did you in that yellow room, and let me spend the whole rest of my life proving that I have learned, too late but not so late as I feared, to hear you before I judge you." He drew an unsteady breath. "I love you. I believe I have loved you these 6 years and called it grief because I was too proud to call it by its name. Marry me. Say yes, and let me love the both of you in the sight of the whole county, and let them laugh, and let them talk, for I have done listening to any of them, and I am done forever listening to anyone but you." For a long moment Eleanor Rushmore said nothing at all. Then she reached out slowly, as if she hardly believed her own hand, and she laid it flat against the front of his coat, over his heart, in the very place and the very way she had once pressed her hand to her own breast in that yellow room to hold her breaking self together. And she felt his heart going hard under her palm, this cold fear and undone entirely, and she looked up at him with her steady grey eyes gone bright, and she said, "You great foolish man." "Yes," Thomas from the doorway said with enormous satisfaction. "I knew he wasn't the wicked kind, and went in to see to his own porridge, leaving the two of them alone in the last gold light of the spring evening, the Duke of Harkstead with his housemaid's hand over his heart at last, and neither of them, for the first time in 6 long years, walking away. They were married in the little village church, and not the grand one Eleanor's asking, and the whole servants' hall wept, and old Barnaby Sole was given the seat of honour, and the county did indeed laugh and talk for a season, and then finding the new Duchess kind and the Duke happy, and the fair-haired boy who followed him everywhere plainly and unmistakably the image of his father, quite forgot to laugh at all. And Alaric Vane, who had spent 39 years being obeyed and feared and never once loved, learned in his 40th to be loved, which is a harder and a warmer thing, and learned it at the hands of the two people he had once, through his own great pride and another man's small cruelty, so nearly cast away forever. He never rode out through the east gate again without remembering the small hand against the iron and giving thanks cross-voiced, gruff, and holy change for the morning a brave and trespassing soul had come to see the house where his mother lived, and had, without knowing it, brought his father home.